next reader is going to be R.Gregory Nokes. R.Gregory Nokes has traveled the world as a reporter and editor. He worked for the Associated Press in Salt Lake City, New York City, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Buenos Aires, and Washington, D.C. He joined the Oregonian in 1986 and retired in 2003 to begin a second career as an author. Nokes has written 2 nonfiction Northwest histories. In 2009, Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon. His newest book, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory in 2013. Both published by Oregon State University Press. The Oregonian picked Breaking Chains as number 6 on its top 10 list of best Northwest books for 2013. It was also about, did I miss the comment? I did. It was also the fall selection for the Oregon Book Club. Nokes was recently interviewed about his new book on the Oregon Public Broadcasting Program, Think Out Loud. The book has also been praised in reviews in the Oregonian and the Seattle Times. Prominent Northwest author Jane Kirkpatrick had said, "This is how history should be written." Nokes' 2009 book, Massacred for Gold, is now in its 3rd printing. One result of the book was a project to install a memorial at the site of the 1887 massacre of 36 Chinese gold miners. The memorial was dedicated in ceremony in Hell's Canyon in June of 2012. A native of Oregon, Nokes did his undergraduate work at Willamette University. He attended Harvard University as a Nyman Fellow in 1971 and 1972. As a reporter in Washington, D.C. for the Associated Press, he covered the State Department and traveled with several presidents and secretaries of state on foreign trips. Nokes and his wife, Candace, live in West Glen, Oregon. Come on up, Gregory.
Jake has a terrific introduction. I wanted you to stop. I went on So, as Jake said, I've written this first book, Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon. Had wonderful results, including this memorial we installed in the canyon in June of 2012. And great support from the Chinese American community. And I was very pleased with the outcome of the book and wanted to write another one. This was published in 2009 by Oregon State University. So I had several ideas for another book. So I bounced them off my brother Bill one day, and he kind of dismissed each one with a polite nod, and he said, "Why don't you write about Reuben Shipley?" And I said, "Who was Reuben Shipley?" He said, "He was a slave brought to Oregon by one of our ancestors from Missouri in 1853. I was dismayed for a couple of reasons. One, I had no idea there was any slave history in the background of our family. And 2, I had not thought there were ever black slaves in Oregon. I'd always understood that from day one, Oregon had a law against slavery, which it did. But it turned out in the early years it wasn't enforced. So I asked my brother, how do I find out about Reuben Shipley? And he said, well, you turn to page 361 of the family genealogy. In the 1960s, my grandparents, Minnie and Will Junkin of Tigard, Oregon, published a big, thick genealogy in a red cover, and I'd been given a copy along with other family members. And I carried that with me on my assignments to Salt Lake City and New York and Puerto Rico and Buenos Aires, back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C., and back to Portland. I'd never read it. But my brother had. And so on page 361, there was the story of Reuben Shipley. Now, he was brought out here in 1853 by a white slaveholder ancestor of mine. So I had my directions for another book. And so I began to explore the subject of slavery in Oregon. And I was to discover there's probably about 50 slaves. Nobody knows the exact number in Oregon in the period from roughly 1844 to close to the Civil War. And I came across, and well, I should mention the number of slaves in Oregon in that period pales in comparison with the number nationally. You might know these figures, that the 1860 slave census had 115,000 in Missouri and nearly 4 million nationally. An incredible figure. So 50 isn't much in terms of numbers, but in terms of slavery, in terms of slaves in Oregon, I was astounded. So in exploring this subject, I came across a family named Robin and Polly Holmes and a slaveholder named Nathaniel Ford. Nathaniel Ford was a big guy in Missouri. He was a member of the Missouri legislature, who was a 4-time county sheriff of Howard County in central Missouri. And he had slaves, at least 13 slaves and a lot of property. In the late 1830s and 1840s, the economy of Missouri went into the tank. Nathaniel Ford lost a lot of his slaves, lost a lot of his property, and as many other Missourians in this period decided to come to Oregon, because Oregon was offering up to a square mile of free land to the early settlers. And so somebody knows the story. So Nathaniel Ford came out with, in fact, he led his own wagon train out in 1844, a prominent guy, and he brought with him 6 slaves. Nobody brought more. There were 5 members of the Holmes family, Robin and Polly Holmes, and a 6th adult slave named Scott. It's sad to know that the Holmes did have to leave behind 3 of their children, because as Ford lost his slave, he sold off 3 of their other children, and the Holmes never saw them again. So the promise was, as many slaveholders did give to the slaves they brought to Oregon, was, if you help us get our farm started on a big square mile of land, and we'll give you your freedom after a few years. And indeed, that happened in many instances, including the slave who was brought out by one of my ancestors. But Nathaniel Ford was different. He decided to keep his slaves, despite a law against slavery. So he brought them out in 1844. In 1850, he finally released Robin and Polly Holmes. But to do that, he'd insisted that Robin go to California and mine gold for him, and then when Robin came back, he would free him. He made the same arrangement with Scott, only Scott died on the trip back. But when they got back, he freed Robin and Polly Holmes, but kept 4 of their children. And his argument was, well, I brought these children across the plains. I fed them, clothed them. They were small children. Now they're old enough to do work. I'm entitled to some of their labor to repay me for my investment. Well, this was obviously a distressing development for Robin Holmes. And so he decided to file suit against Nathaniel Ford. And so I'm going to read a little bit about how this came about. Now keep in mind, Robin Holmes was an ex-slave. By this time, Nathaniel Ford was already in the territorial government. He served 5 terms in the territorial legislature. If you look in your Oregon Blue Book, you will see Nathaniel Ford listed as the first judge of Oregon. So he was a big guy. Hard for an ex-slave to take him on, yes? Well, this is how it came about. One of the children had died in Ford's custody, Harriet. Harriet's death in 1851 seems to have galvanized Robin Holmes in taking action against Ford. 2 of his children were dead, and he and his wife had little hope of ever being reunited with their 3 children in Missouri. On April 16, 1852, Holmes filed for writ of habeas corpus in 2nd District Court in Polk County to require Ford to appear in court with Holmes' 3 children. Holmes' subsequent testimony would strongly suggest he blamed Ford for Harriet's death and wanted to rescue the other children before something happened to them. How Holmes came to file the suit is a matter of conjecture. Was he encouraged by a friend, a neighbor, perhaps someone who had witnessed his despair? At the time of Holmes' suit, there were no laws in Oregon prohibiting African Americans from filing a lawsuit or testifying in court against whites. Well, that was soon to change. After the suit was filed, the territorial legislature did very quickly pass a law that banned African Americans from filing suits against whites. We know Holmes was someone who stood up for himself and his family. But think of the odds. He had lived his life as a slave, raised in a slave culture, bought and sold at the whim of others, unable to read or write. Slaves were deprived of education. He was up against a powerful man with powerful connections, recently elected to the territorial legislature. Yet despite all, Holmes was a risk taker. This would be evident again years later when he and his wife would be among a handful of African Americans, all former slaves, who integrated the white church in Salem. Prior to bringing his suit, Holmes had had several angry exchanges with Ford over custody of Holmes' children. Most likely these occurred at Ford's home. We don't know what was said, but we might guess how they started. Did Holmes arrive on foot or by wagon to confront Ford, who after a shouting match ordered Holmes to leave? Was it during one of these arguments that Ford threatened to seize the entire Holmes family under the new Fugitive Slave Act and return them to slavery in Missouri? All this came out during the trial. Did Holmes go in anger and frustration directly from Ford's home to the Polk County Courthouse, a new two-story wood building in Dallas, and enter unannounced into the prosecuting attorney's office to seek help? If so, he may well have been greeted with curiosity, even suspicion. There was a black man, possibly ill-dressed in work clothes, covered with dust from the grist mill, unable to write his own name and probably knowing little or nothing about Oregon legal procedures. One can imagine a clerk trying to shoo him away, ignoring the man's simple plea to help him get his children back. Someone then, or earlier or later, did take him in hand. That someone was Reuben Boyce, the prosecuting attorney for the Oregon Territory. A native of Massachusetts and a graduate of Williams College, Boyce arrived in Oregon in 1851. He had traveled mostly by ship with a land crossing of the Isthmus of Panama. It would be easy to romanticize a possible scene in Boyce's office. While sitting at his desk on a warm afternoon in early spring, he hears Holmes pleading for help and resisting the clerk's attempts to get him to leave. At 31 years of age, Boyce is new in his position, appointed prosecuting attorney only weeks earlier by the territorial legislature. He is from Massachusetts, a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. This could be his first case, an important one. No slavery case has yet come before Oregon's territorial courts, nor would there be another. He lives within 10 miles of Ford's farm and no doubt knows who Ford is. Perhaps he doesn't care for Ford because he is a slave owner. Whatever it is that motivates him, he asks Holmes to come in and sit down. All that could be true, some of it true, none of it true. Boyce could have met Holmes at James Nesmith's grist mill where Holmes worked as a laborer. Perhaps Nesmith, out of sympathy for Holmes' plight, mentioned him to Boyce. What is certainly true is that something or someone did bring Boyce and Holmes together, and Boyce took charge of the case. That case dragged on for 15 months before 3 different judges, none of whom would rule in the case, until a new judge was appointed by President Franklin Pierce in 1853. That was George Williams, who had been a native of New York from Iowa and obviously had abolitionist sentiments. He'd never been to Oregon before, but within a few weeks of arriving in Oregon, he settled the case. And he ruled in Holmes' favor, and Holmes got his children back. We don't know a lot about Holmes. It's a sad story because this is a heroic figure in Oregon. The fact that he carried this suit forward in those circumstances, found someone to help him, prevailed over 15 months, obviously a person without means, so he got a lot of help, but that he prevailed against somebody like Nathaniel Ford and won that case is really quite remarkable. And we do know in later years, as I mentioned, he helped integrate an all-white church in Salem, also a heroic thing to do, and yet hardly anything is known about his life. And this is one of the sad stories about minorities in the early Northwest, that nobody was keeping their history. This applies to the Chinese Americans who were here. There were many thousands of them doing the mining and building the railroads, and yet they weren't keeping their history. Most of them spoke Chinese and wanted to go back to China. The African Americans that came, many of them were illiterate. They weren't able to keep their history. And so they've almost become anonymous in history, and yet many of them contributed in very meaningful ways to the development of the region. So I try to write about some of that in these books. And I think I run out of my time, and I'll be happy to take a question or two if anybody wants to ask. Yes?
Well, you mentioned the Chinese, how much that they influence things. Did they come over voluntarily, a lot of them, or were they brought over forcefully, or how did a lot of them end up?
Well, they wouldn't have been brought over forcefully, except in the case of some prostitutes that came over in that period. But for the most part, One would say that they had to come because they needed a job. They came for economic well-being. They came from very poor villages, and there was opportunity in the United States, just like there are for Hispanics, you know, today. What drives them is need. And so they borrowed money, $50, I think it was, for the cost of a voyage across the Pacific. Usually they went first, they all came to San Francisco, and then later on into Portland. They were fairly well organized. They were received by a Chinese corporation called Chinese Six Companies, which registered them and helped them find jobs. And then they had to repay their passage over time. And many of them went back. There's probably 300,000 over a period of years from, let's say, the 1850 to 1882, when the Exclusion Act was passed. If you know that history, the federal government passed a law excluding Chinese from coming to this country. You can believe that. Of course, Oregon has its own exclusion laws, too, against African Americans from coming to Oregon. That's a whole other part of history that's in this book. Great, thank you very much.